If you see yourself in the woods, run the reason I'll never take my son camping again. Jake, my 11-year-old son, blindsided me one day when he asked if we could go camping. I nearly spit out my lukewarm coffee in surprise this was coming from the same kid who complained about the sun's brightness at soccer practice and whined about mosquitoes at night. So when he suddenly expressed interest in camping, I couldn't help but chuckle. It was such a far cry from his usual pastime of being glued to anything with a screen. We were hanging out by my truck one morning, talking about school, when Jake first mentioned camping. He nudged a pebble along the dry road, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Hey Dad," he began hesitantly, "do you think we could go camping sometime?" I couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. Apparently, Jake's friend Daniel had been endlessly bragging about a camping trip he went on with his dad, making the great outdoors suddenly irresistible to my screen-obsessed son. "Camping," I said, trying to contain my excitement. "Sounds great. But it's not all fireflies and S. Morris. There are bugs, for one thing. Lots of em." Jake grimaced, his enthusiasm briefly dimming. "Yeah, I know," he mumbled, kicking at the dirt with his sneakers. I gave him a playful nudge. "If the weather holds, maybe we can just find a good spot by the lake next weekend. Just you and me. You up for it?" "Yeah," Jake said, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. His response to the lake idea didn't seem genuine. A subtle shrug and a glimmer of disappointment in his eyes revealed his desire for a more immersive experience, one that involved tents, campfires, and a genuine escape into nature. Merely visiting the lake wouldn't cut it. Only a true camping trip would satisfy him. Truth be told, I hadn't been camping in years. Fond memories of childhood fishing trips and backyard campouts with my own dad feel like a lifetime ago. Work had a way of taking over, and lately, it had been consuming more than its fair share. But after listening to Jake's retelling of Daniel's camping trip story, it stirred something in me, a friendly rivalry. I was suddenly determined to one-up Daniel and his dad to make sure my boy had the camping trip of a lifetime. A grin spread wide across my face as I promised Jake, "Yeah, you know what, Jake? We're going to go camping, and it's going to be the best camping trip ever. As soon as I can take a break from work, we'll go." Jake's excitement was contagious. He jumped up and down with joy, and I couldn't help but laugh. It hit me then that I probably should have introduced him to camping sooner. "Thank you, Dad," he shouted, his voice ringing with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you." I gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "All right, champ, let's simmer down a bit," I chuckled. "Head inside and get started on your homework. We don't want Mom holding this over our heads," I added with a wink. Jake nodded eagerly and practically skipped into the house, leaving me with a warm sense of fatherly pride. The weeks flew by, and I finally managed to snag some time off work. In the evenings, I'd pore over articles and videos on wilderness survival and the delicate art of s'more making. My childhood camping memories were more fuzzy nostalgia than concrete know-how, and I couldn't let my lack of experience show, not in front of Jake, and certainly not in front of Daniel. Meanwhile, my ever-supportive wife, Sarah, decided to forgo the mosquitoes and campfire smoke for the comfort of our home. She said it was girl time with a good book and a long bath, but I couldn't help but sense a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Traitor," I'd jokingly tease, reminding her of our grand mission to outshine Daniel and his dad's camping trip. She'd just laugh and say, "Go conquer the wilderness, honey. I'll be here holding down the fort." It was true that Sarah wasn't exactly an outdoor enthusiast. She enjoyed a leisurely stroll in the park, but multi-day camping trips weren't her cup of tea. Still, I knew she secretly loved seeing Jake and my bond, and deep down I hoped this man's wild adventure might reignite my own forgotten love for the outdoors. My mission? Mastering the art of building a fire that wouldn't leave us all choking on smoke. Identifying constellations for Jake, hoping I wouldn't mix up Orion with the Big Dipper. And maybe even catching a fish or two, although, based on my past fishing experiences, that might be the biggest challenge of all. It was time to put my crash course in wilderness survival to the test and create an unforgettable camping trip for Jake, one that even Daniel and his dad couldn't top. At last, the weekend we'd been waiting for arrived. That Friday, as I picked Jake up from school, excitement buzzed through the car as we pulled into the driveway. The moment we stepped through the front door, Jake's eyes widened in amazement at the sight of the camping gear I had meticulously, or so I thought, laid out for him, like a treasure trove for an intrepid explorer. The living room had transformed into a chaotic staging ground for our trip. A giant, green tent bag rested at his feet, while two mismatched sleeping bags, one of vivid orange, the other in subdued camouflage, leaned precariously against the table. Beside two overstuffed backpacks, I'd proudly displayed a bounty of rations, mostly marshmallows, chocolate bars, and enough instant ramen to feed a small army. "Ready to conquer the wild with me?" I asked. Jake didn't disappoint. His eyes sparkled with an unspoken thrill that seemed to shout, "I can't wait to tell Daniel I went camping too." With the car packed to the brim and threatening to keel over at any sharp turn, Sarah pulled me aside just before we left. Her usually bright and playful eyes held a seriousness that cut through my usual humor. "Please, be careful out there," she said, her voice tinged with worry. I knew this wasn't the moment for jokes. Squeezing her hand, I gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll be fine," I promised, hoping my confident smile would hide any lingering anxieties about my own lack of camping expertise. Jake and I settled into the car, the engine rumbling with the promise of adventure. Determined to make Daniel and his dad's Crystal Lake camping trip look like a backyard picnic, I'd scoured maps and forums for the perfect spot. Jake had mentioned that Daniel and his father had gone camping at the Crystal Lake campgrounds, conveniently close to our town. Crystal Lake, I teased, as if it were the last place any self-respecting outdoorsman would pitch a tent. "We're going somewhere way better," I added with a wink. Our destination was Whisperwood Forest, a hidden camping ground 3 hours north. As the miles stretched before us, Jake peppered me with questions, his enthusiasm keeping my energy high. "Are there bears in Whisperwood?" he asked, eyes wide with a mix of fear and excitement. "Maybe," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant, though a flicker of unease ran through me. The forums did mention some black bear sightings. "But that's why we have all this camping gear, right? To be prepared for anything." Jake's questions ranged from the practical "will there be a bathroom" to the fantastical "do you think we'll see Bigfoot?" By the time the landscape outside our window blurred into a patchwork of greens and browns, his voice had grown hoarse, and a peaceful silence settled over the car. We veered off the main road, following the rhythm of a narrow dirt path snaking through the dense forest. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy overhead, casting long, dancing shadows on the dusty track. The air hung heavy with the earthy scent of damp moss and decaying leaves, punctuated by the occasional chirp of an unseen bird. With every bend and dip, the car swayed alongside us, its tires crunching on loose gravel. I caught a glimpse of Jake in the rearview mirror, his head bobbing with every bump, his eyes wide with anticipation and fixed on the passing scenery. After about 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing, the sudden brightness of unfiltered sunlight momentarily blinding me. As my eyes adjusted, I took in the scene. The clearing was modest in size, about the size of a tennis court. In its center stood a gnarled oak, its branches reaching out like skeletal arms. An eerie silence enveloped the area, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves in the still air. I brought the car to a gentle stop, the engine sighing softly as it died. Jake's eyes sparkled with anticipation as he looked over at me. "Ready?" I asked, my voice echoing in the sudden stillness. His nod was eager and swift. As I stepped out, my joints popped like distant firecrackers. I retrieved our backpacks from the trunk and hoisted the tent onto my shoulder, its weight familiar and grounding. I let Jake take the lead as we scouted for a camping spot. I knew it was important for him to feel like the captain of our adventure and the leader of our expedition. Watching his determined strides and furrowed brow as he surveyed the land like a seasoned explorer was hilarious. Eventually, we found a suitable spot, or rather, my son did, tucked away from the car and hidden by thick underbrush. Sunlight danced through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on a carpet of moss and ferns. Nearby, a crystal clear stream burbled, its melody harmonizing with the chirping symphony of unseen insects. It was a secluded paradise, the perfect refuge for me and my son, nestled away from the world within the forest's embrace. With a proud grin, Jake declared our campsite found. While he scampered off to explore the nearby stream, I tackled the seemingly straightforward task of pitching the tent. However, the instructions were akin to cryptic hieroglyphs, filled with diagrams resembling abstract art and terminology that would challenge even a seasoned scholar. 20 minutes later, after much head scratching and muttered curses, the tent stood, albeit with a noticeable lean to one side. "Behold," I announced, trying to hide the beads of sweat gathering on my forehead. Jake, ever the diplomat, simply grinned. "Coolest tent ever, Dad." As we unrolled our sleeping bags inside the tent, I sent Jake on a mission to gather sticks for our fire. He scampered off into the undergrowth while I patrolled the edge of the woods, collecting stray logs to bolster our firewood stash. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a figure peeking from behind a tree, but I dismissed it as a trick of the fading light. Igniting a fire, often portrayed in movies with a single dramatic swipe of a flint, turned into a comedic ballet of fumbled matches and stubborn kindling. My attempts at channeling my inner caveman were met with sputtering defiance from the damp sticks. After 20 minutes of frustration, I surrendered to the ease of modern technology and pulled a lighter from my backpack. As if sensing my defeat, the fire roared to life with a satisfying crackle. I called Jake back, and together we roasted marshmallows under the shifting hues of the evening sky. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with fiery shades of orange and red, we shared stories and laughter, leaving behind the worries of city life for the simple joy of being together in the wild. As the clock neared 9 p.m., exhaustion settled over us like a warm blanket. Jake, his eyelids drooping like weighted curtains, readily agreed that it was bedtime. I subdued the fire with a few nudges from my boot, but instead of fading completely, the embers seemed to pulse with an unnatural inner light, casting dancing shadows across the forest floor. The usual nighttime sounds of crickets and rustling leaves took on an unsettling tone. A distant howl pierced the silence, long and mournful, similar to an owl's call, yet somehow different from any I'd heard before. A chill ran down my spine, prompting me to pull Jake closer and tuck him snugly into his sleeping bag. "Just an owl, champ," I reassured him, trying to sound confident despite my unease. My voice echoed strangely inside the tent, adding to the eerie atmosphere, but Jake, already drifting off to sleep, remained unfazed. Before I knew it, my eyes had closed and I drifted off. It felt like no time had passed before a soft nudge at my shoulder stirred me awake. Squinting in the dark, I made out Jake sitting bolt upright, looking at me. "What's wrong?" I mumbled, my voice heavy with sleep. "Sheech," he whispered, his voice trembling. "There's something outside." Half asleep, I assured him it was probably just a squirrel, or a similar creature, and encouraged him to try and sleep. I turned onto my side, seeking the comforting embrace of sleep once more. But before it could claim me again, I heard a sequence of sounds distinct from the forest's usual symphony. Footsteps, deliberate and measured footsteps, circled our tent. These weren't the light steps of a deer, or the clumsy thudding of a bear. There was no natural rhythm to them, no telltale snap of a twig. They were silent, calculated movements: 2 steps, a pause, 2 more steps, a pause, as if whatever lurked outside was deliberately trying to be quiet. 2 minutes stretched into an eternity before the pattern resumed: 2 deliberate steps, a pause, and then 2 more steps. Wiping the sleep from my eyes, I propped myself up. A glance at Jake confirmed he was still awake, his eyes wide with terror. In a hushed tone, I promised to investigate. He gave a small nod, and with a deep breath, I inched forward, my hand trembling as I unzipped the tent just a crack. Peering through the gap, I found the darkness outside impenetrable, the only light source being the faint embers of our extinguished campfire. Squinting, I strained to see beyond the flickering red glow. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw a figure near the tree line, a subtle shift in the shadows that seemed to move on silent feet. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my tired sanity. Turning back to Jake, I forced a reassuring smile. "Everything's okay, champ. Go back to sleep." Whatever lurked outside wasn't any creature I recognized, and it showed no signs of leaving. As we settled back into our sleeping bags, a sudden noise shattered the silence, jolting me awake. It wasn't the familiar rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. This was a sharp crack, a deep, resonant snap of a fallen branch, weighty and too close for comfort, a cold sweat instantly coated my skin. Whatever had caused that sound was heavy. Quietly, I rose from my sleeping bag, the tent floor feeling small and exposed beneath me. Retrieving my flashlight, I unzipped the tent fully, with deliberate care. The chilly night air rushed in, stealing my breath momentarily. With trembling hands, I switched on the flashlight and swept its beam across the surrounding woods. The once familiar trees now loomed ominously in the darkness. Shadows danced and twisted in the flickering light, playing tricks on my already rattled mind. I scanned the forest floor for any sign of the creature, a footprint, a snapped twig, but found nothing. Yet, just beyond the flashlight's reach, a glimmer caught my eye, a subtle movement, a flash of reflection. I focused the beam in that direction, my heart pounding, but saw only the swaying branches of a nearby pine. Convinced that the source of the noise was ahead of me, I turned away from the tent. However, the sound of leaves crunching behind me shattered that assumption. Whirling around, I aimed the flashlight toward the tent, partially illuminating my son, who sat upright with a confused expression. Whatever had made the noise remained out of sight. I had almost convinced myself that it was merely a curious animal nosing around behind our tent. Just as I was about to dismiss the fear and retreat into the safety of the tent, ready to label the sounds as harmless, the source of the noise revealed itself, a moment that stretched my sanity thin. It stood up from behind the opposite end of the tent, where it had been hiding. It, or me, standing over the tent, partially bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight. It defied all logic and reason. Even as I stared directly at it, my mind struggled to accept what my eyes were seeing. It wasn't an animal, as I had initially assumed. It was me. I found myself locked in a gaze with myself. It had my face, but it wasn't me. Its limbs extended from misaligned joints at the shoulders, longer and more spindly than mine. Though humanoid in shape, its proportions were wrong, with its limbs extending at unnatural angles. Clad in tattered clothes akin to my camping attire, its body seemed like a grotesque mirror image of my own. The most unsettling part was its face. It mirrored mine in almost every detail, save for the eyes' voids of absolute blackness in place of my familiar brown eyes. When caught in the beam of my flashlight, those eyes revealed twin specks of light within the darkness, staring back at me with an unnerving intensity. A single glance revealed its formidable strength, far surpassing my own. Its arms, thick with sinewy muscle, bore the unmistakable markings of a life lived in the wilderness. These were not the sculpted muscles of a gym-goer, but the rugged strength forged by the trials of nature itself. Mountains climbed, rivers crossed, battles waged against the elements. As its mouth contorted grotesquely across its face, the skin splitting like parched earth, a wet tearing filled the night air, an agonizing sound that sent a primal scream echoing through my mind. The chill of the night was now a distant memory, replaced by a fear so profound that it threatened to immobilize me. Suddenly, a voice pierced the silence, a small, vulnerable voice belonging to Jake, calling out from within the tent, asking if I could see anything. At the sound of his voice, the creature's attention shifted sharply toward the tent. It leaned in, drawn by Jake's innocence, its already unnaturally wide mouth stretched further, the lower jaw unhinging to an impossible length, revealing a menacing row of needle-like teeth. The thing raised its elongated arm, which moved unnervingly stiff and jerky, like the movements of someone who hadn't felt flesh beneath their fingertips for years. I could see each joint crackle and pop as it extended its arm. I was confused as to what it was doing, but then realization hit me. Instinct took over. I plunged my hands into the tent, grabbed Jake, and yanked him out with all my strength. Yanking him from the tent, we stumbled out, the ground a sickening blur beneath my feet. We landed in a heap, the sound of ripping fabric filling the air as the creature tore through the tent like a child ripping through tissue paper. The metallic tang of blood, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. I covered Jake's mouth with my hand, feeling his tears against my skin. We lay there in silence, watching the thing eviscerate our tent. Amidst the chaos, my bag was flung towards us. Recognizing it, I rummaged through it until my fingers closed around the car keys. Leaning close to Jake, I told him when I gave the signal that I wanted him to run for the car. In the tense silence that followed the creature's assault, a distant noise momentarily captured its attention. Seizing the opportunity, I whispered to Jake, "Run!" We sprang up and bolted towards the car, the creature's piercing shriek chasing us from behind. My lungs burned and my legs screamed in protest, but I pushed on, fueled by a primal urge to protect my son. Reaching the car, I fumbled with the keys, the creature's rasping breaths hot on my neck. With a satisfying click, the door was unlocked. We tumbled inside, slamming the doors shut, just as the creature lunged forward, its fingers scraping against the metal. With trembling hands, I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. In the dim light, I could see the creature standing mere inches from the car, its grotesque smile contorted in what seemed to be frustration. With a surge of adrenaline, I shifted into reverse, then spun the car around, tires churning the earth as we sped down the trail. We didn't stop until we got home. Throughout the drive, Jake remained silent, his soft sobs a stark contrast to my own stifled emotions. That night marked the end of our camping trips. It doesn't look like I'll be beating Daniel and his dad's camping trip anytime soon. I work at a toll booth on a lonely country road. Please stay away. I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged up freeway with lines of cars packed together, waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The one I work at couldn't be further from the stereotype. The toll booth I operate is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the woods surrounding it, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack with chipped paint and an old sign that reads 25C, an amount I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 50s. I guess that's when they decided to stop pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm, which I can flip up or down. The interior is simple, with a single chair and a light on the ceiling, the only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator on any given night most nights. That's me. On the surface, it doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that makes no money, and believe me, they pay well. But if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. No, there isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m. What we protect by keeping this booth running is worth far more than any monetary cost could make up for. In my town, the job of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly respected and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's something of an unspoken rule that you keep private any conversations about the booth, the road, or anything related. Everyone around here knows there's something off about this place. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain or something they wish they hadn't. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends. Most of the time, their residents embrace the myths. I suspect it's because they all know it's a myth, save for a few crazies. Our town is the opposite. We keep quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is steer people clear of the road and hope nothing strays from it. The last we wanted was for the rest of the world to find out, and I suspect we're not the only ones. You see, our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade, our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever stuck looking for work. The reason this is noteworthy is that our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. This money is coming from somewhere, and it's not from our little property taxes. I've got a suspicion that the feds or someone else is dumping money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth situation as well. I know this all sounds ridiculous now, but once you get a better idea of my job and of recent events, I think you'll understand. As I said, the booth only has one operator each night, a tradition that goes as far back as we've been a town. Each week we hold a private meeting at our town hall. At this meeting are all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't last longer than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer. The reason for which you will know soon enough. I suppose this is a good time to explain what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule 1: the booth does not need to be attended during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up, but the attendant for the night, which is usually me, must be at the booth an hour before sunset and stay an hour after sunrise. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any time during their shift, for any reason. Transportation isn't an issue because either the sheriff or one of the deputies always gives us a ride to the booth at night and a ride back to town in the morning. Rule 2: no cell phone, radio, or other electronic or communication device is allowed while operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is allowed to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device accidentally, shut it off, store it inside the booth, and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth is not an option. Should your device turn itself on inside the booth, your next best bet is to destroy it. This sounds like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. It lasted about an hour before I couldn't take the screams coming from my phone and stomped it into oblivion. I haven't made the mistake of taking it with me again. I've never been told what the screams and other noises are, but I do know that past attendants have heard the same thing. Rule 3: as rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A common trait among those who end up on this road at night is confusion. The attendant's job is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The driver, along with confusion, may express other emotions. They may be distressed, angry, paranoid, or fearful. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they are ready, you will simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur. If the driver has no notable reaction, questions you, or hands you a regular quarter, you must leave the barrier arm down and turn it away. Do whatever is necessary to try and make them leave. If they threaten you, or attempt to drive through anyway, you can let them know you will be calling the police, even though you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All of the locals know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it. Though we have, on occasion, had to deal with a few lost travelers, most of the time they are compliant. Get them off the road as soon as possible and direct them towards town, where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot pass through the gate. However, if you ask them to pay their toll, another outcome is possible, and unfortunately, the most common. They'll come to a sudden realization, as evidenced by their facial expression. It's as if they remember something, slowly reaching into their pocket and pulling out a black coin. They know they'll have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate graciously, others cry, but they all follow the road once the barrier arm is lifted. Around the corner they drive, never to be seen again. In my first months working here, I was confused as to who these people were. I wondered what it was they knew, how they got these coins in the first place, or what the coins were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning, after I got home. They talked about a man who was killed in a car accident the night before, and showed a picture of his face. A face I had seen only hours before, puzzled and afraid as he asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he froze, slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand, and pulled out a black coin before placing it in mine. He gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning, recounting the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, he was just passing through. As were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to somewhere beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that, at the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But, as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades ago, a visitor from out of town was passing through town. Back then, he didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know the road, because it was never put on any map. My best guess is that he happened to see it, and figured it could be some sort of shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was, of course, turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant, pushing him over and raising his arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then, they only knew the rules, not the consequences, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through, but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night he pulls up, confused as to why he's here and needs to pass, and forgets each time. Each night he gives us a coin. Each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, he is not seen until the next night. He never ages, and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times he expresses a sense that he's been here before, and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers sometimes. His fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies. Dead but not being allowed to move on, and never remembering why you're there, living the same moment night after night after night until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule 4. At some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something big. Sometimes they emerge from the woods, other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be afraid. No harm is coming your way, quite the opposite. However, I can see how this would be hard to believe. In any case, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I remember the first time I saw them. I could hear a clop somewhere down the road, coming towards the booth like a horse galloping. I rose to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, intrigued. I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been told what to do in that scenario. When I did point my flashlight at the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me. A bull moose was approaching with a brisk walk. Of course, I was warned of this, but the details I was given were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate, and I was supposed to let it through. I wasn't told that this thing stands at around 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the massive antlers, which are white as snow in contrast. The only other part of its body clearly visible from afar were its eyes, which shone with a small speck of white light, glowing in the darkness. I screamed and retreated to my booth, tempted to run off into the night and abandon my post. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down, and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, only to meet another set of eyes, identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again, I yelled but contained my volume when I realized whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on. Something akin to a shadow. Just like everyone in their cars, they walked down the road beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy that those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift in expressing my frustration was I told more. Apparently, this hunter and his moose have been around a long time. So long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple hundred years or more, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have been around. What we do know is that they aren't bound to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a written account of the hunter and his mount riding right through town in the middle of the night back in 1919. To this day, a few residents have seen the moose while they're driving at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what we attendants call him. Every so often, he and his moose will arrive at the booth, dragging a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal, or even a human, for that matter. I mean abominations out of your wildest nightmares. Things that send a shiver down your spine and make you want to vomit at the same time. Things you would expect to find talked about in a religious text when the end of days comes. The hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be certain of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve. Or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different places. I couldn't tell you. What I believe, like the other attendants, and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose, is that they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's taking with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now, this is where we get to the point why I'm telling you about all of this. I explained before that the people in my town like to keep these things quiet, and for the most part, I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago, during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular, poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him, all was quiet for a few hours until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days, I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it. Before I moved to raise the barrier arm, I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind and the dreadful thing attached. The end of the rope was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man. A man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most grotesque part. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in the skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer's. Blood dripped out of its half-open mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and texture as a man's but shaped like a deer's. It was like someone took human ears and stretched them out, morphing them to fit the disgusting shape they desired. On top sat a red and blue jester hat, and a set of antlers sprouted out above them. I froze for a moment upon seeing the entirety of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a job to do, and that I better do it if I didn't want to see this thing any longer. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose resumed its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind. A streak of blood followed on the road behind it. Right before it passed by the booth completely, I lit up its face with my flashlight to get a final look. Its eyelids shot open, revealing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat before it leaned down and clawed at the knot holding its hooves. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut, and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial attempt, however, because the bull moose in front of it struck its head with a powerful kick. Another splash of blood came from the clown's mouth, along with one of its teeth, as it fell back to the ground, seemingly knocked out for a moment. While it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I ran from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road, but I kept an eye on the fight. Air shot from the moose's nostrils as it began to grunt. His grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. The clown finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleats out, as if to challenge them. At its standing height, this thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged. Before it connected, the clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back, but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away, with the hunter holding the new rope. They began to drag the clown by the neck, I assume hoping to finally make it around the bend this time. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time. Hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods, the hunter and his moose followed. In only a moment, they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all, which was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed a tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it meant. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days and all would be sorted. I dearly wish that was what happened. A day later, a video surfaced on the internet from the town. It showed a pair of deer antlers sticking out above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outside. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video sure did. Last week, someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees, far off in the distance. These are just the ones I've seen. Now you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started showing up around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They try their best to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaways when they show up to our bars and diners, striking up a conversation before asking folk what they've seen around here lately, asking about the booth and the strange road. In the last week or so, they've stopped trying so hard to hide it. Black government CVs have been crowding the parking spaces downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall along with every other document and record we have about the booth, and now it's all missing. It's clear that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to happen, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work last night, but the attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He pleaded with them not to drive through, but in response they told him they already knew why they shouldn't, something we weren't expecting. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. I suppose I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I figured I would at least tell all of you before the feds. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night. Sticking to my duties is about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only guess based on the posts I've strung together, but it looks like the clown is still on the move, and our hunter is close behind. I can only pray that he catches it soon. In the meantime, if you hear strange laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside.